Welcome to Fakenham District Community Archive, archiving and reminiscing our memories of yesterday. You know how it is sometimes when you're walking around town and you look at all the different places and buildings and you think to yourself, I wonder what used to be there in the past, or what was there before they built that new shop? There are lots of ways you can answer these questions. You might have noticed some of the many heritage plaques we put in different places that tell you a bit about the history there. Or you could come to one of the archive days that we have every month in church to watch more slideshows, show us your pictures, or browse through all the interesting books and scrapbooks we have. You can also talk to other local people there, some of whom may have been neighbours or workmates in the past. Indeed, often one of the best ways of finding out more about what things used to be like is by talking to the people who lived and worked in Fakenham in the past, listening to their stories and reminiscing. So, today we're about to watch a past and present slideshow that's being presented as a kind of historical enactment, like actors being used to narrate the programme. The show is focused around Elizabeth Lancaster, a purely fictional resident of Fakenham, who is imagined to have been born in one of the heater cottages that once stood at the bottom of Wells Road in Fakenham. And she is heard reminiscing about what living there might have been like. We'd like to make it clear that while Elizabeth and her family are fictional characters, everything else in the story is indeed factual. So, let's sit back and enjoy as Lizzie takes us on a nostalgic walk into town.
My mum told me there used to be lots of cottages on the corner where we lived, but later they were all knocked down and most families moved to the new council estate. Everyone called this end of town Low Town. I don't know why, but I think it was something to do with the church.
All owned by the engineer, John Garrod, these were known as the heater cottages, because many thought that the land on which they were built resembled the triangular shape of flat irons. The workshops of carriage builder William Wharton and Mrs. Tuthill's millinery workhouse stood behind them. They were demolished in 1936, and many of the residents moved to King's Road and Jubilee Avenue, Fakenham's first council estates.
When you came out of our cottage, one of the first things you saw was some wooden huts opposite here. They had shops in them. That was where we used to buy packets of broken crisps for a penny.
These were wooden military huts that once served as the town's sub-post office. They were demolished in 1971 after replacement shops were built behind them.
That big house beside there is called Lancaster House. Albert used to say it was named after us. Mum said originally they made bikes there. There used to be a garage there too, called Massey and something. It became Blake and Howard after Massey's moved into the town.
This was an engineering business set up in and beside Lancaster House by John Garrod in 1844. He designed, made and rode bicycles, and with his son John Cousins and his brother Charles, he's famous for first inventing tubular forks for bikes. Massey and Bridges garage stood beside it before moving to the Crown Barn in Bridge Street in 1921. The site was then taken over by Blake and Howard, another garage.
Going towards the town, there's that big arch with the date 1834 at the top, leading to houses behind. Next door but one is Gillum House. It's where one of the doctors used to live, Dr. Fisher. He looked after Mum before she died.
Named after a Scottish businessman, William Gillum, this house was built in 1835 and sold to Dr. Fisher in 1906. When he died in 1954, it became an optician's. In the 60s, it was a hairdressing business, and in 1980, Colin and Susan Vogel turned it into a vet's. In 2001, they moved to Holt Road to set up in bigger buildings.
Further along here, there was a school, two in fact, a girls' school at the bottom and the boys' school up the top of the little hill.
The National School for Boys, at the top of the lane, opened in 1839, and the National School for Girls and Infants near the bottom in 1848. The boys' school was sold off in 1919 and was thereafter used as a band room. However, for a brief period during the late 1950s, the old boys' school reopened. This was to ease overcapacity at the Queen's Road School. Following years of neglect and vandalism, the building was given a new lease of life as a Kingdom Hall, before finally being converted for residential use. When the girls moved to Queen's Road in 1913, the building became a church hall, used during the war by the Red Cross.
Someone told me that after the Great War, a big German gun was put in the front of the old girls' school, but I don't remember that.
A First World War German field gun had indeed been put on display there. In April 1917, soldiers of the Norfolk Regiment captured a battery of 6 German field guns, one of which was offered to Fakenham by the War Trophies Commission. The first suggestion was that it should stand outside the new Queen's Road School, but because the children climbed and played on it, the authorities placed it outside the church hall, where, lo and behold, children still found it irresistible to play upon. The gun was eventually sold for scrap during the Second World War. Before being demolished in 1973, the building had been used extensively as a community hall, hosting a variety of events, including meetings, parties and dances. Fakenham's first pop group, the Electrons, often performed there.
Right opposite here is the Nelson Pub car park, which I think was used years ago as a livestock market of some sort.
The pig and cattle market stood here, behind the Lord Nelson pub, in Nelson Road, closing in 1882 to move to what's now the car park next to Cattle Market Street. In 1846, the building at number 5 Wells Road became the Cattle Market Tavern, before closing in 1957.
Further along here, right opposite Nelson Road, was Mr. Love's Tailors, a tiny little shop selling quality handmade clothes for men and women.
Alfred Love's Tailors opened in number 56 in 1892, before moving to number 26 in 1925. Number 56 later became a boot and shoemaker's, then a vegetable shop, florists, a wine merchant's, a lamp shop and eventually a beauty salon.
Just opposite Alfred Love's, on the corner of Nelson Road, was a bakery, although we always got our bread from Mr. Moore, just here in Nelson Road.
The end of Nelson Road became known as Tuck's Corner, after George Tuck set up his bakery here in 1882. It was later an antique shop and then became Schofield's bookshop. Close by, at number 3 Nelson Road, was another long-established baker, H&J Moore, who, in addition to the bakehouse in Nelson Road, also had a shop and tea rooms in Upper Marketplace.
We were very lucky to have so many good shops on our doorstep. There was Mr. Andrews, a gents' barber at number 58, where my Albert went to have a trim-up. I can just remember this being John White's bicycle and jewellery shop before opening his big shop in the marketplace. Right next door at number 55 used to be the electricity showroom of the East Anglian Electrical Supply Company, and opposite that was Mr. Lewis's furniture shop, who was also an undertaker. A sign over the door was kept illuminated all night to draw attention to their undertaking business.
This part of Oak Street certainly had a rich variety of trades, which included a butcher's, baker's, greengrocer, 3 pubs, a builder's, a hairdresser and a florist. There was even a midwife here to see you into the world, and an undertaker when it was time to leave.
This pub here is where my Albert liked to meet his mates on a Friday night. They all enjoyed a game of darts, dominoes, crib or even shove halfpenny.
In the 17th century, the Star was used as a pilgrim's house, a surgeon's shop, washhouse and stables. When it became licensed in 1829, it was known as the Sheep and Pig Market and Star Inn. And this was well known in 1861 when the publican, Guy Hagan, was put in jail for having debts of £227. It closed in 2013 and was converted into a private house.
Just over the way is the Methodist Church. It looks quite old, but I can remember it being built when I was little.
The primitive Methodists originally worshipped in a bar in Star Meadow Yard that opened in 1829. Later, some cottages on Oak Street were demolished to make way for Ranter's Yard, where a state-of-the-art chapel was built. It opened in 1908 and was dedicated to the missionary Henry Buckingham, who did much of his work in Africa, where he finally died. It started being converted into flats in 2020.
Down the yard, between the church and the old rectory, was Dunthorne's dairy. They had their own cows, and I can remember them delivering milk. No, not the cows, silly, the Dunthornes. They delivered all over the place by horse and trap.
Dunthorne's Dairy had started in a tent on Star Meadow, selling dainty tea, until they hired the Rectory barn in 1923, later opening a tea room and a confectioner's on Oak Street. The next barn was owned by the Star opposite. It was used by the Salvation Army before their new chapel was built, and then it became Cox and Wyman's Printers Paper Store. In 1972, their employees took it over to use as a social centre called the Press Club. In 2022, it was converted for residential use.
When I was little, this big garage there was called Southcote's, who made all sorts of smart-looking carriages. They sold bicycles too, and cars. The tall house used to be the rectory with a great big garden where fetes were held and the town band played in the summertime. When Mr. Edmondson took over, the bit in between, which had been stables, had petrol pumps put there.
Southgate's garage was built here in 1828 and later sold the Model T Fords. It went on to become Edmondson's in 1952. It utilised the former rectory as offices, as well as building a new filling station. This area is now the entrance to the Tesco supermarket. Over time, the old rectory building was used as an adult education centre, offices for the Citizens Advice Bureau, and eventually Sowerby's estate agent. In a wall close by, you can still see remnants of the arched passageway that gave the vicar easier access to his church. Built in 1800, this Georgian building was the town's second rectory. The remains of the first were discovered in the centre of what's now Tesco's car park. The first rector, called Wymers, was appointed in 1226. That building was also surrounded by a rectangular moat, due to its proximity to the Wensum, which still occasionally leads to flooding there.
The lovely old house which stood opposite Mr. Edmondson's was pulled down about 10 years ago. It was called the Oaks and was where local doctors always lived.
Built in 1766, it became a doctor's practice and was used in turn by Dr. Coomer, Dr. Fisher, Dr. Palin, the grandfather of the actor Michael Palin, and then Dr. Arthur. The kitchen garden was surrounded by what was known as a crinkle-crankle, or serpentine wall, that can now be seen surrounding the scout hut. The house was demolished in 1965 to make room for a new youth club, community centre and public library that was opened by Lady Cook in 1969.
Here's another pub. Some say this one might be the oldest one in Fakenham.
The Royal Oak Inn was built in 1781 and was a public house from 1829 until 1975, when it became a craft centre, a coffee shop, and then William H. Brown, the estate agents.
Apart from losing my dear husband, one of my lasting memories of wartime Fakenham was the night a German bomb hit the lovely old Salvation Army temple, reducing it to a pile of rubble. It's a blessing no one was hurt.
Built by the Wesleyans in 1892, the Salvation Army had only been there for 6 years before it was hit by a bomb in World War II, and they were forced to worship down the road in the Star Barn until a new chapel was built in 1955.
One of my favourite shops along here was Louisa Eakes, a ladies' clothes shop where I would often stand looking in the window and dreaming of wearing one of their beautiful made dresses or frocks.
Webster's Draper and Milliner's shop opened in Oak Street in 1892. Louisa Eake, who had previously worked as a draper's assistant in Norwich, joined them as a partner. Then by 1901, Louisa was running her own business there. In 1917, a third storey was added, which led to objections from the chapel next door regarding the blocking of light. The alterations, nevertheless, went ahead. Louisa sold her business to E.A. Baker Limited in 1925, who continued as a general and fancy drapers and milliner. Today, 12 Oak Street is the Salvation Army's charity shop.
Another favourite, of course, was Mr. and Mrs. Speake's confectionery shop and tea room, here, right on the corner. So many sweet treats to tempt you inside. This wide part of Oak Street used to be called Broad Street. That's Mr. Powell's saddlery shop right over there. It's been there ever since I can remember. There's not much call for it now, but years ago there would be all kinds of horsey things, saddles and the like, all hung up outside across the whole width of the shop.
The Powell family established their business in East Rudham in 1820, moving to Coronation Yard, Fakenham, in the 1870s. John Powell moved his saddlery business to No. 5 Oak Street in 1902, when Frederick Lack, also a saddler, vacated the premises. After J.W. Powell closed it in the mid-1990s, No. 5 reopened as a coffee shop and second-hand bookshop called The Dancing Goat. Then, in 2014, it became Bunny's, another cafe, but one which, together with the refreshments, offered a range of men's, women's and children's clothes. Currently, it's Taylor's, which, when established in 2007, became the third cafe in succession to occupy No. 5.
You can't really miss this big old building just here. It's the cinema, where I sometimes go if there's a good film on. Not for much longer though. People are saying it might be turned into a bingo club. Years ago it was the old Corn Exchange.
In the 17th century, this was the site of the Market Cross. The Corn Exchange was built here in 1855 for the price of £4,000. Originally, it had a large glass dome on the top, which lit the building's interior. This was removed when converted into a cinema, and is rumoured to have been used later as a greenhouse. As a community building, the Corn Exchange had many uses. As well as being a venue for concerts, exhibitions and auctions, it also meant a library with a reading room and a magistrates' court. In 1930 it was converted to become a 700-seat cinema. After closing in 1976, it became a bingo club until the early 1990s, when it lay empty and unused for a couple of years. Then, in July 2000, an extensive refurbishment, it opened it as the Hollywood Cinema. Today it's known once more as the Central Cinema, after becoming independent in 2017.
The Coronation Memorial lamp over there, next to the public toilets, started off in the marketplace and was lit by gas. It's got a funny looking electric thing on top now that reminds me of a sort of spaceship.
The memorial lamp, commemorating the coronation of King Edward VII, had originally been in the Market Square. Replaced in 1921 by the War Memorial, it was resited next to the underground public toilets by the Corn Exchange. The introduction of a new one-way system in the 1970s forced another move, this time to a space opposite the library, before finally being returned to the marketplace, taking pride of place in front of the Red Lion.
Now, you know what people say about bulls in china shops? Well, just here behind the cinema years ago was Mrs. Bambridge's china shop. When passing it, it always reminds me of the time when Mr. Chapman's old Hereford bull strayed into Joseph Baker's china shop in Norwich Street. People laughed about this for years. What made it even funnier was that a royal party from Sandringham, which included Queen Mary, happened to be visiting at the time. Afterwards, it was said the Queen remarked that, while she had often heard of a bull in a china shop, she had never before seen one. Funnier still, the beast actually left the shop of his own accord, without causing a speck of damage. People laughed and said that old bull knew better than to misbehave in such eminent company.
Mrs. Bambridge's glass and china shop became a post office in 1846, her husband Martin being the postmaster. The post office then moved to Bridge Street in 1906.
Well, my dears, that reminds me, I need to nip to the post office in Holt Road now to post this letter. You can choose first or second class now, you know. I'm still struggling to get used to this blinking new European money, decibel or something it's called. Anyway, I really must be off. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this funny old lady's memories of old Fakenham Lowtown. It's been nice sharing them. Thank you for watching.